Hi, everyone. So this is the last webinar of our five-part series. I'm Nassim Nobari. I'm one of the founders of Seed the Commons, which is a grassroots organization that's based in San Francisco. So some of you will have been here the previous webinars, others of you not, that's fine. Mostly this webinar is going to be about sort of a report back of COP30, People Summit, all of that, but also we want to bring these topics together with what we covered over the past weekends, and so wrap it all up together. Now, today is not a great day. It's not a happy day because there's a war with Iran basically starting. So I want to mention that sort of the background of Seed the Commons. Before founding Seed the Commons, I turned to look at, food systems and issues around food systems and land and these things, because it seemed that that was the way to get to more of the root of the problem. If we're thinking about war, if we're thinking about human rights abuses, and of course, environmental issues, all of these various issues, um, it's looking at food systems and changing, looking at who has land, who's growing food, how they're growing it, allows us to kind of get to the root of things and create real systemic change. And then a few years later, the reason for Seed the Commons specifically came about because as a vegan, as an animal liberationist, not only was I not exactly finding a place to plug in the food movement in a way that completely aligned with my ethics, but on top of that, I saw that the fact that the movements around, ecological farming and, all of these things were growing, and it was a good thing that these movements were growing and gaining popularity. But at the same time, the fact that they were growing and gaining legitimacy also was sort of um, undermining the animal liberationist movement. There was sort of a conflict between these. And so, see, the Commons also was a way to address this as well. All right. And so, so at the end of the day, as I've said in one of these webinars, and I said, in Brazil and Belém, what we've all been talking about is some aspect of colonization. And of course, war is also that. And so we're going to bring that in as well and, sort of see how the climate movement ties in with other struggles and what it means in our present movement in our present moment to be talking about these issues at all. All right, so I'm going to just read Chema's bio. He's going to start. Let me just find this. Sorry, Chema, I'm just looking for it. All right. So Chema is a union organizer in San Francisco and a co-founder and board director at Seed the Commons. Chema was raised vegetarian and experienced his family's shift to eating more dairy and processed foods when they left Mexico in the late 1980s. Over the years, he also saw how people's diets in Mexico changed in similar negative ways. Along the way, he acquired an understanding of how Native North American food systems were colonized. All right. Thank you, Chema.
Thank you, Nassim. So, hi everyone. It's nice to see so many folks joining us, and it's nice to see some names that I recognize. I really appreciate it. Um, so I'm going to start the presentation. This will be a presentation that we did in a modified version when we did a report back for the union that employs me. So for some of you, this will be material if you attended that one, which you might have already seen. But it's going to really add some depth from the civil society side and the perspective of community groups and grassroots organizations like Seed the Commons. So COP30 and People Summit report back. I want to provide a little bit of a context because I'm sure many of you all have kept hearing this term COP, whether it's COP20, COP15, COP30. And it's not necessarily super obvious what it is. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what the UN Conference of Parties, that's what COP means. So the COP is the annual United Nations Climate Change Conferences. So this is something that happens every year. It is the principal international negotiating forum around climate change. It is through these conferences that we both got the Kyoto Agreement and the Paris Agreement, which I'm sure all of you have heard at this point. And this is a current framework that we're under. And this is, of course, the one that the US withdrew from in January 2025 when the second Trump administration took office. Now, civil society groups like unions, grassroots groups, NGOs, big environmental groups like Sierra Club, Greenpeace, they always have limited influence at this COP because it mostly depends on what governments do and how receptive they are politically to hearing about uh, these perspectives, right? It also means that groups like companies can take a lot of influence in these. So, who benefits from comps? It is a bargaining space, right? And for many of you, hopefully you have a sense of what bargaining is, whether you're part of a union or you're negotiating a contract. COP negotiations are largely driven by the powerful. That is either the countries, industries, or just capitalists in general. The United States, of course, had a lot of influence. The European Union has a lot of influence. Countries like China have a lot of influence. But then smaller countries, countries like Central American countries, many sub-Saharan African countries have very limited influence individually. They might have a little bit more together, right? But it's challenging. Now, that said, there are certain realities that have been impossible to ignore. So countries have had no choice but to recognize the science of climate change and even the validity of some of the proposals made by civil society, such as just transition. Now, I want to pause here a second and talk a little bit about just transition because it is a term that didn't come out from COP. That it is a term that COP adopted, right? Because it was what civil society was asking for. Many labor groups, many nonprofits, many environmental organizations were talking about the idea that the livelihood of workers should be protected by new regulations that address climate change. So when we talk about moving away from oil, how do we protect the workers whose lives depend on the production of fossil fuels? So this was an idea that came from the outside that was backed by the science and that COP and many of the negotiators had no choice but to adopt. So now it has been adopted as part of the normal process. All of that said, there remains very real tension. This leads to a need for spaces where people can organize, discuss, and mobilize to increase pressure on the official COP negotiators. So that leads me, of course, to spaces like the People Summit, right? They became parallel summits necessary for the negotiating and the organizing of civil society. And again, civil society is not a term that's often used in the United States, not a term that you'll hear on CNN, certainly not on Fox News, but it is a term that is really completely normal outside of the United States. It is this collective of people who are outside of government, civil society includes labor unions, includes grassroots groups, includes faith-based organizations. If you attend a place of worship, you're part of that civil society. So these parallel spaces became necessary for the civil society as a whole to organize. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the logistics of participating at COPs and particularly COP30. The influence of civil society is proportional to their presence, which in turn is limited by material resources. So you need to be at some of these spaces to be able to talk to negotiators. These negotiations are going on for 10, 15 days at a time. They are actually in a space, right, where people from governments are talking to one another. So you need to be there to engage them in a conversation, to persuade them that your perspectives and your priorities should be taken into account, right? And that takes money, right? You need to not just get an airplane ticket, but you need to go and get a hotel room. All of these things means that it's not something anybody can just do, right? Prices go up whenever these places are announced. So because COPs only happen once a year in one place in the world, that money is critical and necessary. In the case of COP30, because it happened not just in Brazil, but in a small town in Brazil, a little bit out of the way, it created a huge disparity. Hotel prices and flight prices were absurdly expensive. This, of course, created a huge opportunity for corporate lobbyists. They don't mind paying 10, 20, $30,000 for a trip, right? They have the resources. And we saw that very clearly in COP30, right? In our case, I was very fortunate to participate because I got support from my employer, and also because Seed the Commons was able to get support from the Brazilian government to attend the indigenous who created the Indigenous Village, and we'll talk more about the Indigenous Village. But you'll see here the photos, the Aldea Co-op, the village co-op, and these are the photos of the barrack-like rooms that we were provided during the event, right? So uh, I think not enough space is devoted to talking about the logistics of participation, but it is important to discuss and to mention. So as I mentioned, these were important. It led to more than 1,600 fossil fuel lobbyists being granted access to the COP negotiations. Now, I want to emphasize this: 1,600 lobbyists for a single industry. We're walking around these government negotiators, talking with them, inviting them out to dinner, inviting them out to lunch, bringing little gifts, right? It creates just an absurdity of sorts, right? And that presence, however big, was dwarfed by the presence of the agribusiness. Now, the agribusiness, we'll talk more about this, but this is all the big companies that are devoted to the production of food, right? Whether it be plants, but also animals, right? They had an actual zone called the Agrizone, and I have the map. I'll send it out. It was this huge area where members of the agribusiness could essentially just talk to folks. You had the presence of a lot of multinationals, Nestle, car manufacturers talking about why their perspectives around agribusiness were critical, right? And of course, the end result is that country negotiators became very easy targets for these corporate lobbyists to persuade them, to cajole them into their perspective. I want to talk a little bit about organized labor because I am a union organizer. But beyond that, unions are one of the few entities and spaces where they have some resources more than a grassroots organization, perhaps not as much as some of the big environmental groups, but put together, they have a very meaningful ability to actually engage in the material and the content that's being discussed. Now, all of that said, the disparity was huge. Organized labor at COP30 was very aware of this disparity. There were only 100 union negotiators, so that's a ratio of 1 to 15. The unions in the United States had only a single person, in large part due to the withdrawal of the US, of course, but also because of expenses, right? I wasn't, of course, a formal negotiator, right? And that led to, of course, a palpable frustration on labor priorities being deprioritized within the negotiations. And some of them were simple dismissal, right? Such as the location of COP31, right? The idea that it shouldn't be held in a place like Turkey that has taken a very anti-labor, anti-union perspectives, right? So, of course, there were all their issues around just transition. So, that said, it was very clear that organized labor had a very capable and engaged delegation in much the same way that many of the larger, more organized nonprofits like Greenpeace also had. Now, let's bring it back to the People Summit. The People Summit was a very different experience, but limited in very clear ways. It was a multi-day event. It was organized over many months with a huge focus on popular education and creating a rigorous framework for people to learn about climate change and take climate action. Um, there were huge mobilizations. They had significant local and national, federal, Brazilian support with the presence of a lot of elected officials and labor unions. Here you see photos of their climate minister walking. Uh, she was being treated like a rock star, right? But unfortunately, despite a lot of that organizing, there were a lot of empty rooms, a lot of empty seats. Very few people were attending the spaces for that popular education, and that was unfortunate, right? It again highlights the disparity between summits, the official summits like COP30, and then the more popular and grassroots events like the People Summit, right? We're going to talk a little bit more about this during the Q&A, but it was a little bit jarring to go from one space to the other to see, air conditioning, to see wayfinding, people guiding others to different events, and then you go to the People Summit, which is supposed to be the space where people are supposed to connect and talk and learn, and also educate each other, right? And those were empty. There's the video. So the Agrizone, the Agrizone, if I were to talk to use a word, it's shameless, right? They were very confident, despite being in the Amazon, despite the impact of animal agriculture on deforestation, the impact on indigenous people, that even, of course, led to cases of slavery, as you saw, or as you might have heard in one of our first webinars. Right, it's very clear they have huge political power that is very significant, and they're not afraid to show it and wield it, right? There was, of course, also great unfortunate silence from civil society in regards to the impact of this industry. We saw them place a lot of emphasis on the impact of fossil fuels, that sort of thing. But when it came to actual discussion around the impact of the agribusiness, there wasn't much to be said. And you'll see here well, you might not be able to see, but some of the companies that were sponsoring the Agrizone. So you have Bayer, a lot of international companies. You have the Gates Foundation. All of these companies that are here just very clearly pushing their agenda, talking about genetic modification of cows, of plants, making sure that they extract as much possible from the environment and from the Amazon as possible. And again, this is just being done out in the open in an area that is bigger than the official summit. Well, than both the open to the public and the closed negotiating area, the blue zone and the green zone. And this leads to the corporate influences. Um, Corporate influence within the COP30 was very evident. Even the water being given out was sponsored by Tetra Pak, a Swiss company, right? Everything seemed to be have some sort of corporate logo or another. The spaces as well. Other important issues were highlighted by some individual participants, but that wasn't the norm, right? You saw the Asian Mayors Forum who discussed Gaza, but again, it was a tiny, tiny fraction. And to even have a space in these official spaces and the official forum required tens of thousands of dollars. Indigenous issues were also front and center, but it was very performative and in line with the general corporate attitude towards indigenous peoples in Brazil. And for that, I did want to highlight the photo of, here it was at a supermarket that I took it, but really a Coca-Cola selling their products with, strong imagery towards indigenous youth, right? So that's the sort of attitude that they really had towards this. So what's next? So as I mentioned, the U.S. is absent from all of these spaces. Unfortunately, California is there. In California, labor, of course, had a presence. But really, what becomes to me very clear is that there is only one path forward for civil society, and that is to build a climate alliance of labor, grassroots, environmentalists, and faith communities. I think we're well on our way to doing that. But it becomes critical when you see the disparity and the power of some of these spaces. It is difficult. It can be heartbreaking at times, but I think that's the only opportunity we have for pushing back on the level of organization we see from the other side. I want to highlight, of course, Greenpeace was there with their huge boats, and that's wonderful to see. They're really making an effort to be present, to be visible. Not they don't have the same ability that the agribusiness has, but they're there. You see, the Catholic Church, Jesuits for Climate Justice, they created a lot of documentation, and there was a lot of presence from communities of faith. And then, of course, California elected leaders and elected leaders from other parts of the United States and the world going there and making sure that they understood that this was critically important. So that is where we're at now. Nassim will make a few comments. Let me stop sharing. And I am going to introduce Nassim because you hear a lot about her, but you don't necessarily know a lot about her. So it is important for me to make that proper presentation. So Nassim Nobari is another co-founder, the other co-founder of Seed the Commons. Nassim has a background in human rights and anti-war activism. She came to see food system as a key to addressing the pressing social and environmental issues of our time. As a longtime animal liberationist, she came to see the promotion of veganic farming as strategically necessary and urgent part of animal liberation activism. Under her leadership, See the Commons took veganics from a niche farming practice to a veritable social movement. Nassim has written two book chapters covering various aspects of this movement building. Thank you, Nassim. And I hand it over to you for additional comments.
Thank you. So I'm not going to do a presentation. I'm just going to give some comments on various aspects of all of this. And then hopefully we'll have time for more of a Q&A and discussion. And if I forget anything, then hopefully you guys will bring it up and help me cover everything that we should cover. All right. So I wanted to start with sort of thinking about all of the events and all of the work from November and everything that led up to it, and sort of ask the question of like, was it worth it? Did we achieve anything? You know, these sorts of things. So starting with the trip to Brazil. Now, when an organization like ours goes to something like this, there could be sort of three different objectives. One would be to make a difference at the main event itself, to, be able to go to COP30, speak with the delegates, and through that process, make a difference. The other is to make a difference through participation in the alternative events, the People Summit. And then the third thing could be to disrupt the main event, which in my mind kind of ties into the second objective, because when you try to disrupt the event, you're giving the message that this is not a valid space, that it doesn't have a legitimacy, that that's not where space happens. And so in a different way, we're already doing that by participating in the summit. So for Seed the Commons, we don't have accreditation to go to the blue zone of COP30. It's very difficult to get. It takes years. The people I know who were going there, some of them were using other people's accreditation and so on. So maybe at some point we'll do that. But our goal was to participate in the People Summit. So we're already starting out with a certain position already right then and there, to make a difference through the summit and not through the main event. But we did meet people who were, in some cases at the Green Zone of COP30, which is open to nonprofits and civil society. It's just that it costs a lot, like really a lot of money to have a space there. And they were engaging both with sort of the general public that came. And so, for example, Loving Hut, which is a vegan sort of nonprofit chain, they were there. They were engaging both with the general public and also they were going and speaking with the delegates. So that's one approach. Then you have the summit and then you have the disruptions. There were some disruptions that we didn't participate in of the main event. And in the past, often the sort of whatever the equivalent of the People Summit would be, these alternative events would have also some disruptive actions. So make a difference through the summit. Are we doing that? Because I think that there's a lot to say about the failures, the limitations of COP30 itself. Chema has already said a lot about it. We could say a lot more. Others have written about it. Um, but what about the summit? Well, I think that at the summit, the goal is not really so much to sort of send a message to the decision makers directly. It's more about connection, popular education, sort of empowering each other to carry our activism forward. And then maybe there's some direct organizing that happens then and there, but that's sort of an additional thing. And often it's relevant more to, well, I mean, in this case, there were some activists from sort of everywhere across the world who had actions planned at COP30, like German activists and so on. So that's part of it. That can also, give a message. But in terms of COP30 itself, I'd say that having sort of a powerful impact directly on decision makers is something that is more the case for those who are local. So, for example, Brazilian organizations like the Landless Farmers, movement, they go there and Brazilian elected officials are there. And so that becomes a space where, there can be some benefit to showing up. And politicians also want to, show that they support these movements and so on. But for others, I feel like the point is more long term. It's more about connecting with people from around the world, putting out certain ideas, popular education, and so on. And as Chema said, I feel like it wasn't a bad event, but I feel like we could do better probably in the future in terms of, is it really worth it to fly all the way there and do all these things? When ideally, I think that, there's so much that we should be focusing on, all of us, more locally. So when we go there, how to really make it worthwhile. And in this case, um, I don't know. I think it was good, but I'm not, feeling like it was 100% there. So to give an example, you know, at the People Summit, one, huge difference with COP30 is that the messages that you hear are mostly good. I mean, the vision is mostly good. People's heart is in the right place. They're talking about food sovereignty, they're talking about agroecology, they're talking about transitioning away from fossil fuels, all of these things. Yes, it is lacking, I would say, in some ways. As you all know, we went down there largely to speak about the grazing issue and its connection to deforestation. So yes, that was lacking, but nonetheless, by and large, there's a lot of good messaging happening there. But I have to ask myself what really we're achieving when we sort of repeat the same things over and over again. And I think that sometimes when there are events like this, the report backs might be maybe more optimistic because some of the people who attend them might be younger and it might be, their first or second time going. And so they meet people from around the world who are talking about, agroecology and so on, and it feels very inspiring. But if you've been in these spaces for many, many years, then it starts to feel like, okay, well, we're putting all this time into creating yet another statement, but the statement reads like statements we've done before. And so that's sort of where I'm at. I don't think it's bad to participate in these spaces. Again, I think that the vision is largely good. I just feel like in terms of organizing, um, we can do better in terms of really thinking about the practicalities and what we want to achieve. And so another example would be Gaza, for example. So, there were a lot of people in Kifyez, people, spoke out about Gaza. I had a moment where I went and spoke with the senator of the state we were in because I happened to have caught a sort of interview he was doing, which we can speak about later, but he was talking about colonization in Brazil, and he didn't mention the economic drivers of it, and certainly not agriculture as an economic driver. So I went and I sort of, kindly, politely, but confronted him on that. And I sort of saw, I normally don't wear a keffiyeh, but that day I had one because I had my talk and we had wanted to put it, use it in the room to sort of signify the interconnectedness of these issues. So I had my keffiyeh, he had a keffiyeh, and I thought, well, so many people have their kefiyyehs here, but what does that mean, really? We're just signifying that we want agroecology, we want, all of these things. But when are we sitting down to train each other? Where does the popular education model aspect of this become truly practical? And so that's what I think we could do better. And I think that what I'm saying here applies more to some groups than others because some larger social movements and organizations sort of are already connecting with others, uh, in their network. And so they're already achieving something practical. So it's not really applying, it doesn't really apply to everyone. But I'm just saying that because we didn't have necessarily that cohesiveness, the practical value of it wasn't sort of spread out to everyone, I think. Now, again, I think that sort of the heart and soul of these spaces, is in the right place. But it is true that in the same way that you don't hear about, really basic things at COP30, at places like the People Summit, you do hear about some things, but you don't hear about others. And so in this case, we were in Brazil. We were at the sort of the entrance to the Amazon. The primary driver of deforestation in the Amazon is, cattle ranching, and that's something that we spoke about. And the group that was here that did the first webinar 2 weekends ago, they spoke about, but otherwise we didn't hear about it. So that was also one of the reasons that I thought it was important to have this webinar series to help sort of spread this out. Some of the challenges at the People Summit were truly just, logistical issues, nothing to do with anything, malicious, nothing to do with anything like that. It's just some logistical challenges where I think that we can do better in terms of where we put our focus. And I think that sometimes as organizers, you kind of get the task ahead is so big, like organizing an event like this, it's so big that that becomes all you see. And so you kind of lose the forest for the trees. Like, what are we achieving here? What are we achieving there? One example is we had talks were divided into thematic axes. And I feel like the work that went into just deciding on those axes and organizing that was probably not very well spent. So I feel like the summit is good, but I would want, if I were to go to one of these events again, I would really want to think, very clearly about how to maximize really the benefit that we're getting, what we're contributing. When we say popular education, for it to be really something practical that people can learn and take home. All right, so now going to Brazil was not the only thing we did in November. On the last day of the summit, there was a climate march in Belém. So, tens of thousands of activists marched in the streets of Belém. Chema and I marched. We had a banner that said, I don't have a picture here, but we have a banner that said, small farmers, climate healers. something about veganic farming for a cooler planet, and then true regeneration from north to south. So we co-organized a climate march slash solidarity march in San Francisco because the organizers in Belém had put a call out. They asked people around the world to do that, to organize solidarity marches or solidarity actions on that day. And so we did. Other groups co-organized this with us, including the California Labor Union, and I'll speak a bit to that later, how I think it's important to be looking towards labor in particular to work on these issues. And then we realized that on the same day, there were groups that were organizing a People Over Billionaires march in San Francisco. And so we all agreed to merge those two marches because obviously these issues are very connected. And so in terms of a report back of that march, there are things we could have done better. Some of these, again, were just logistical things. So when we decided to merge the marches, for example, the ACE that was sort of leading the organization of the People Over Billionaires March had already printed all of their stuff. They had already made all their outreach materials. And so the climate aspect didn't get included in, a lot of what went out. So, there are small things like this that could have been done better to have more visibility in what we were doing. But despite these limitations, I think it was a really important, very positive first step because what we did was really bring together, first of all, connect San Francisco with activists in Brazil and activists from around the world and, create this solidarity internationally after the US has removed itself from the international community, essentially removed itself from these climate talks. And so as grassroots activists, we're creating those international links and we're, stating our support for activists in the global South by having these sorts of marches in San Francisco. So that was one positive thing. The other positive thing was bringing together in San Francisco these various, people who are environmentalists, people who are vegan activists, people who are union organizers, all of these different groups. And I wanted to share, and, putting out these messages together. Sometimes people say, well, do marches really have an effect? I think sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, but sometimes you don't measure the effect immediately. It's not that everything changed with that march, but I think that putting out these messages together is something that's really quite new. And so I wanted to share, and, is impactful for the people who are there. So I wanted to share, or Chema, can you share the video of Martha speaking? So Martha is a member leader and a chair of the SEIU Local 1021 Climate Justice Committee. She is one of the people who spoke at this People Over Billionaires slash climate march in San Francisco. And so she brought all of these issues together and she spoke about transitioning away from both industrial agriculture and animal agriculture. And I think that's such an important step for us to achieve, to get these messages, included in this type of activism.
Let's have some applause for unions. Yes, my name is Martha. I'm a member of SEIU 10-1, that's Service Employees International Union. We endorsed this march, as did the whole San Francisco Labor Council. Let's give a hand. Let's give a hand for unions. Our member, Chema Hernandez Gil, is now in the Amazon, in the streets, and he is sending messages of solidarity from the indigenous people from the world over that are in the Amazon now, demanding real climate solutions. Let's give a hand for everybody in the Amazon. Yay! The message they sent to me is this: the official United Nations talks refuse to address fossil fuels or animal agriculture. So only people in the streets are demanding the real solutions. While politicians argue and corporations, billionaires, spread disinformation, real climate leadership comes from indigenous peoples and global movements. We are a part of that. Let's have a hand. I'm also, as a union member, a member of SEIU 10 to 1 for Palestine. Thank you to everyone wearing keffiyehs and keeping Palestine on our minds. There is a connection. Billionaires don't want Palestine to exist. Our tax dollars go to starve and bomb and shoot Palestinians, who are the indigenous people in a land where they continue to resist. Let's have a hand for resistance everywhere. Our tax dollars are used for nefarious projects by billionaires. As union members, we fight them every day. We fight them on the job. We fight them in our neighborhoods. And we will never stop. Let's stop those billionaires right here. As we defend our native plants, our animals, so do Palestinians. We want the indigenous people and the native plants and animals and people to survive and thrive. We are a global movement. We continue to resist, and the tax dollars that we spend on war need to be here. We want union jobs for everyone. We want just transition. Union rights. Let's have a hand for union rights. Rights for migrants. Rights for migrants.
Yes!
We do not want to be displaced from our city, from our homes, anywhere. We stand up for our rights, and I will say, I was in Paris 10 years ago, and the chant that I just heard came from Paris 10 years ago. We are unstoppable. A better world is possible. We are unstoppable. A better world is possible. Thank you.
Martha, yay!
All right, thank you so much, labor movement. All right, so
Okay, so I just want to say I've been having some issues with my computer, so if I go away, I'll be back in a few minutes if this shuts down. But one last, sort of aspect of this report back is as Chema said, the aspect of Indigenous representation was very performative. And yes, it's good that the Brazilian government set up this space for Indigenous people to participate, both Indigenous people from Brazil, who made up the majority, and also from other countries. But, in a number of ways, it felt like we're not really there completely, and even in just very practical ways. So, you know, so we stayed there, and but we didn't eat there all the time. We kind of just did our own thing. We bought some snacks, but the line for the food was sometimes just so incredibly long. And so even just that, you think, well, if somebody is just grabbing lunch very quickly and going back to speak with delegates, they can have such a more productive trip than when you're waiting 45 minutes in line to get your meal. Small things like this made it so that participation is not entirely facilitated. And then, of course, the message is not something that people want to hear. So when we arrived in Belém, I mean, the whole airport, the way the airport was made up, it had this whole jungle theme, and really you're walking into some attraction park. It was amazing. And other places kind of did that as well. I think the Agrizone also, a lot of these spaces really were ramping up this whole theme around not only the Amazon as an ecosystem, but also, the indigenous culture and so on. But of course, we saw in the news, it was reported on that indigenous people did disrupt the space multiple times because they were saying, we're not being included in the talks. And so participation is not really there, not really allowed. And again, when I happened to pass by the senator of Pará speaking, I was really surprised by how he didn't mention at all sort of the economic drivers of colonization and how colonization is still happening. And I think that that's something that's important for us to all keep in mind. And it's something that I think See the Commons has been talking about for, more than 10 years now. When we speak about the history of grazing in the Americas, we are talking about one of the economic drivers of colonization. Now, the official and original name of our organization is Milacayotl, which is a Nahuatl term. One of our founders is from a traditionally indigenous town. We have a lot of our own experiences with, tokenization and these sorts of things. And one thing that's been interesting is saying that on this particular topic that we've really been speaking about for a decade or more is these questions of grazing and veganics versus animal husbandry and all of this. It's really interesting to see that both the pro animal ag people, the pro grazing people in particular, and the vegans have a similar strategy where they really try to um, sort of use they sort of try to make their arguments, appropriating, you know, kind of, what's indigenous, what's not, and so on. But both of them make their arguments very badly. In both cases, it's a losing argument. In the case of the vegans, I think they're actually doing a worse job because in the case of the pro-grazing folks, this is a bit of a parenthesis. I'll go back to what I was saying. In the case of the grazing folks, you have a lot of this, oh, we're going back to indigenous ways and so on. What they're saying is plainly wrong. In the case of the vegans, though, not only what they're saying is wrong, but even if it were true, it wouldn't make their case for them. They try to sort of make this argument of like, this is how it was, how indigenous people did it, and therefore, but you can't really make a compelling argument for animal liberation in that way, because at the end of the day, your ethics need to be argued for their own sake. All right, I'm going to close this parenthesis and get back to what I was saying. All right, so we have had also, as an organization that is partly indigenous led, that has been, by and large, mostly people of color, that is a grassroots organization. We've had our fair share of experiences with both tokenization, appropriation, but at the same time, exclusion. And I think that on certain topics, the identity aspect of it is very relevant. But I think that often what's more relevant is the sort of dynamic between grassroots organizers and larger, more established nonprofits and careerists. And that becomes a more relevant thing that also sort of, creates a dynamic where the more grassroots groups that are connected to broader struggles become excluded, the more you get these nonprofit-led movements that are disconnected from, from real solutions as well as, and from, an anti-corporate message, from an anti-war message, and become something quite different. So I spoke about the march that we helped organize in November, that we co-organized. That was not the first time that we organized a climate march in 2018. After the US actually decided to withdraw from the Paris agreements, the governor of California decided to convene in San Francisco also a climate summit. I can't remember the name of, but basically a climate summit. So organizations based in the Bay Area decided that we would have our own alternative to that, as we do. And we organized a large march as well. And so this was the largest climate march on the West Coast of the US. And so See the Commons was involved both in the organizing of the broader march. And also, I took on the organizing of the farmers slash agricultural contingent. So basically, the contingent that was there to say, hey, when we're talking about climate, we need to include agriculture in that topic. And it's not just about animal agriculture or industrial agriculture, it's about all of it. And so we helped organize the broader march. We organized that contingent. It was a lot of work, unpaid work. And I want to speak a little bit about that experience because I think that it really, in some ways, is emblematic of where we're at, where we've been at with the nonprofit system in the United States, but also our political context in the United States for a while. So somebody asked me at one of these webinars, how do you guys get along with like the eco, other progressive movements and all that? And I said, well, the biggest impediment to our work has been the animal rights movement. And so that was definitely the case when I organized that march in 2018. And while I was doing all of this work and I was, running around and I was trying to get funding to bring farmers to San Francisco and I was going to every single event that I could go to speak to people about why this was so important and why they needed to show up and why they needed to activate their base and all of these things. And Seed the Commons at the time was the only organization amongst the organizers of the march, amongst the vegan community, amongst anyone who was calling out the fact that this climate summit had become an opportunity and a vehicle to fund more ranching projects, both in Marin County and elsewhere. We were the only ones calling that out. We were talking about the problems with regenerative grazing. And one of the biggest impediments to this work was that um, amongst the vegan animal rights people, there was an organization that a lot of people didn't like. We have never worked with them, Direct Action Everywhere. We have never worked with them, but we were constantly harangued and harassed about, we should exclude them, we should tell them that they can't come to the march, and so on. Just a complete distraction. And I remember trying to explain to people, even if we wanted to exclude them, we cannot exclude them from a public event. This is ridiculous. I'm not going to go to the other organizers of the march and tell them that this is the issue that they should worry about, you know. And so you had a distraction about internal kind of politics that had, in my opinion, no bearing on the broader work. And so here you have a grassroots organization doing all this work, and again, the only ones calling out the fact that regenerative grazing was being promoted at this event, that, funds were being raised for local organizations that were, doing ranching projects. And instead of being supported by the local vegans, they were putting sticks on our path over these sorts of like internal conflicts and politics that we weren't even a part of, but us not participating in cancel culture was sort of enough to get us canceled. Um, and so the reason I want to bring this up is because my dad used to say about the United Nations that, oh, these people just create work for themselves. They've gotten into a system where they're just, let's find funding to do a report, to do this. And it becomes this self-sustaining system where people are just sort of comfortable having the jobs they have, and that becomes what it's about, as opposed to genuinely create change. And I think that the nonprofit system has partially become that. It becomes something where you're not, whether it's because of funding, whether it's because of ego, whether it's, there can be many reasons, but the nonprofit system has largely become a space that is not always genuinely working on change. And sometimes people don't really realize it themselves, but the priority becomes something else. The priority becomes the funding, the priority becomes the internal conflicts, the priority becomes, someone's ego and their career and these things, as opposed to really a vector for we should actually change something. Now, another aspect of this was that during that time, I was informed by organizers that there was someone who was very respected in the movement who was secretly asking conference organizers to not platform us, to, deplatform us, because one time 2 years ago, we had invited someone who was very unpopular, Wayne Sung from Direct Action Everywhere, to speak at one of our events. So again, you have work that, in my opinion, was very important that is being derailed, um, for this sort of idea of like guilt by association, cancel culture, and so on. And I don't want to delve too much into this, but the reason I'm mentioning this specific event is because the person who was doing this that I found out, first of all, it was very disempowering. The secretive nature of this felt very disempowering to me because I felt like, who knows if this has happened before, if this will happen again. So we're doing all of this work, and yet we're being excluded. And we can't even address it because we haven't been publicly accused. We're just being privately accused of working with whoever, whatever. Now, the reason I think it's worthwhile to mention this specific event is because it's not relevant to mention who it is, but this was a person who had a lot of clout, a lot of legitimacy, in large part because of identity politics. And I think that that's also very relevant, especially for the Americans in the sort of, audience to think about, has been sort of the destructive role that a lot of identity politics have played over the past, I don't know, at least 15 years or more, in social movements. And identity politics is a term that is used to uh, describe different things. And I don't think that all identity politics are bad. I think that some versions of identity politics, like organizing around identity groups for identity groups, is a good thing, and a necessary thing. But some aspects of identity politics are very destructive. And they've been destructive not only for us personally, ironically, given that we are also, a group that could have chosen to put forth identity and so on. Um, but I think that this is something that's relevant not only to the nonprofit world, but to the broader political context. So, one thing I want to mention is that from about, I think, 2015, billionaire wealth increased substantially. I think after 2015, billionaire wealth increased by more than 120%. And so at the same time that you have wealth disparity growing, you have a really massive nonprofit ecosystem in the US that's just not, it's not only that it's not capable of um, fighting this problem, but largely it's not even really geared towards fighting this problem. You have, after the Occupy movement, this nonprofit system that the nonprofit industrial complex that sort of turned to a lot of sort of ID politic type issues and so on. Sometimes that can be a good thing, but often it has been a distraction, I think, from the bigger problems. And another thing to think about is that we have a economic system basically that is imperialistic fundamentally, that is based on still expansion. We talk about colonization of the Americas, and people really like to talk about that. But colonization is ongoing, and it's happening around the world. You have the US that wages wars that are about, resources. And so I think that this is also very relevant to that. I mean, when Obama came into power, people thought, oh, excellent, we have this very intelligent, well-spoken Black president. And the anti-war movement kind of died out, but American wars of aggression did not die out. And now that is more relevant than ever because now you have the US waging a war on Iran, and something that has been really used strongly in pushing for this war has been this idea of like, oh, well, the Iranians are calling for it. So you have people in the Iranian diaspora who are indeed they are in favor of war. They are in favor of installing, the son of the monarch that was deposed in 79. And so this is a very, very, very destructive and I would say childish way of looking at the world that is especially present in the United States, where there's this idea of like, well, a person of color said it, therefore I have to agree. No. Um, and people of color are used in these ways. You find the person of color, you find the Iranian who is in favor of imperialism, you find the person of color who is in favor of whatever harmful policy, and you put them forward. And so I think that it's really time to be more conscious about this bias that has sort of taken over the US and to turn towards spaces and strategies and groups that are really more conducive to change. All right, so when we organized the climate march in 2018, and due to these issues, we ended up not having a space for the march that I had kind of started and so on. What saved the day was the union that gave us a space in their contingent, and we had this wonderful contingent that was very visible behind the fire truck. And I thought that was very symbolic of, who is really not being distracted by, not being distracted in some of the ways that the nonprofit world is being distracted. And so this time when we organized in November, we again turned to the labor movement. But I think that it's more about recreating sort of a real civil society, recreating a real grassroots base that includes labor, but of course is not limited to labor. Now, our strategy, sort of going more towards next steps and lessons, and so our strategy in the past was almost entirely, or really majority, around movement building. So my thinking 10 years ago was there's so much to do, for example, in promoting veganics. If I want to be truly genuine about how can I be as effective as I can be, as opposed to thinking, how can I build my nonprofit or whatever. But if I truly want to be effective, the best way to be effective is to sort of build awareness, empower people to go and take different types of action, as opposed to me having one project. Now, that had its benefits, and we did succeed in really doing quite a lot. So there was a lot of positive to that. But again, we were constantly being confronted with this situation where, yes, we'll take your work, but we'll exclude you from it. And so ultimately, or we'll copy your work and not give you credit, and therefore, and we kept having these issues. And so ultimately, we also had to think about sustainability. And so, one of the things that where I've kind of shifted is to be more focused on direct kind of advocacy, which, as opposed to movement building, which was not my preference from when we're speaking here about more the veganic message. It was not my preference from an animal liberationist perspective, because from that perspective, I think that the way we were doing things has the potential to be more powerful, more effective. But the way we were doing things required more buy-in from people, more support, people working together, as opposed to people being sort of greedy and wanting to just, take things for themselves. But so now the plan is to do more, just put out the message of, this is why veganics is good, is necessary, and so on. From a climate perspective, I think it is powerful to do that. And so I'm thinking, well, I just need to go with the flow. This is probably what the moment really requires anyway. And the other strategy that I had, which was, more about, let's say, we're going to be talking about agroecology, but we're going to, and soil and so on, but we're going to have the space to sort of set the norms around it. I think we're going to come back to that. We, the larger we, not only see the commons, but the others as well. I think we're going to come back to that later. We are going to get there. We're taking a roundabout way. But at this point, I think that focusing on climate and promoting veganics in a more advocacy way as opposed to movement building way is the thing to do. Another thing is more of an international focus. Moving a little bit away from the US, focusing on the international. And I think that in so many ways we're seeing this sort of people saying, okay, well, this isn't the space, where is it happening? And so, for example, after COP30, since nothing really happened, you had the governments of Colombia and Netherlands announce that they're going to have a first conference on just transition. Well, I don't think they called it just transition, but transitioning away from fossil fuels. So I think that in many ways, people are looking to see, okay, well, this space, this approach isn't happening. Let's not all converge where we initially thought. Let's see, where else it can work. Now, for the people who are here, I feel like there's so much that people can do. There's so many ways to be effective. If we all wanted to coalesce around one goal that we would choose, and that would be the one goal that we would all say, okay, this is what we're doing, that could be stopping deforestation in the Amazon. And there's so many ways to do that. I mean, in the past, I remember in the 90s when I was a teenager, my uncle, who's not a vegetarian, has never been a vegetarian, didn't eat McDonald's because of deforestation in the Amazon, and we lost awareness around that. So, that's one thing, bring the Amazon, bring deforestation back into public consciousness, talk about the harm of importing beef, talk about how beef culture here contributes to problems globally, and so on. All right. So I've spoken a lot already. I'm going to leave it there, and whatever questions you have, Chum and I will try to answer them.
Thank you, Nassim. And if you'll indulge me, I do have a few photos of the Indigenous Village, which I would love to share with people so they get a context of the space, because there were a lot of challenges, and I'll show them in the photos, but I think it's better if people get a context. Would you mind if I show them?
No, it's fine.
Okay. So let me. So as I mentioned, we had the pleasure of being hosted at the Indigenous Village. I'm just going to show a handful of photos for people. So first of all, you can see that obviously and unsurprisingly, the vast majority of people attending the Indigenous Village came from indigenous tribes in Brazil. Many of them were clearly folks who were very attached to their indigenous ways. So here you see somebody as we're waiting for breakfast. You can see the very long lines. You can see them dressed in their traditional clothing, right? Which was very inspiring to see everywhere, right? They many of them actually, as Nassim said, it came with the intention of blocking and disrupting the climate summit. So many of them came with their indigenous weapons, right? With the idea of not necessarily using them, but making sure people understood that they meant serious business. So we saw a lot of bows and arrows during our stay. And again, I'm certainly not an expert in the different styles and ways that they wear it, but you saw what I assume are chieftains, right, walking around with their helpers and assistants throughout the summit, right, throughout the Indigenous Village, in and out, going towards the actual negotiating spaces. Now, this one is an image that I do want to show clearly. So this is the line to the showers. The showers, there were about 2,500 people staying at the Indigenous Village. Most of them were Brazilian. And there were 3 showers for the men and 3 showers for the women, or 4 showers for the women, and that's it for all these thousands of people. Right? It meant that the lines started at about 5:30 in the morning, and it went on until middle of the morning, and then they started up again in the afternoon. So you can see the lines. It literally went around the building. So again, emphasis on the lack of infrastructure for these very important central guests, right? Folks just having to wait there for 30, 40, 50 minutes. And similarly, the lines for the food, it was the same thing, right? I didn't really understand why they didn't have more servers or people sharing it, but it just meant that people ended up spending a lot of time in line at the Indigenous Village. It really was frustrating, for people just to sit there and stand around. Of course, the accommodations. So as I mentioned, the accommodations were very basic, right? And this actually did lead to a lot of people getting sick, or, myself included. After about 4 or 5 days in this space, viruses were going around. People were coming in from all over the country, all over the world, right? In my room, there were people, indigenous people from Mexico, the United States, French-speaking Guyana, Suriname. So there were Dutch-speaking indigenous people. There were Spanish-speaking indigenous people from Venezuela, and of course Brazilian, right? So everybody was just there in this small room, right? Getting sick, which I think was very unfortunate. Um, uh, and then but there was still a lot of atmosphere. People were excited. This was one of the events that they had in the evenings. There was a great sense of camaraderie, despite the simple food and the long lines, right? And I think here I have a video, hopefully, that I can share with folks. Uh, What I want to say about that video is this were the Venezuelan indigenous people who were there, and they were a very large contingent, right? And this was, of course, happening just a few weeks before the attack on Venezuela by the United States, right? So it was constantly on my mind, the unfortunate reality of these people living under this sort of situation and fear, right? So I wanted to share that and provide a little bit more context so folks could better understand the challenges that well-intentioned, however it may be, there was a clear lack of logistical thought put into it.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. So I wanted to comment on the Indigenous Village as well, and then I'm going to comment on a uh, couple of the comments in the chats, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So yeah, I just wanted to add some kind of gnarly detail to the Indigenous Village chapter of this. So there were very few toilet stalls and shower stalls for the number of people. And as you probably know, in Latin America, often you don't throw toilet paper in the toilet, you throw it in the garbage next to the toilet. And so yeah, so sorry, I got so basically what happened was that there were so many people and not enough people cleaning that you had just these garbages of toilet paper that were overflowing, like on, just like overflowing and then like on the ground of like used toilet paper. And I mean, that's just not only disgusting, but it's really a breeding ground for disease. And then at some point, I remember that because I think there weren't enough garbages either. I think that maybe one of the women took a garbage can because she wanted to put it somewhere else. And so you had one of the toilet stalls that didn't even have a garbage can. It just had like a mound of dirty toilet paper. So you had like a team of cleaners who would do a great job when they were there, but there just were not enough cleaners for the number of people. There were not enough shower stalls, not enough toilet stalls. And so you think, it's really a mixed bag. It's like, yes, it's great that they made this space, but at the same time, the basics here are really not provided. I mean, the basics are a clean space. That's one of the basics, and that's not provided. And then on the Sunday that we were there, things were even worse. In the hallways, garbages were overflowing. And then we figured, oh, maybe because it's Sunday, the cleaners didn't come. But that's not acceptable when there are so many people. And then, yeah, at some point, like I sat on my bed in a certain way and like one of the planks broke. So it really felt like, in the same way that at COP30 itself, you had all this imagery, you had, these delegates from other parts of the world who are, saying like, how can the international community support the indigenous people, all of this. But at the same time, what they're saying is we're not being included. And they're, organizing disruptions because of that. Here it's the same thing. Yes, the government set up this space. Yes, that's great. But it would be easy to have more people cleaning, serving food. It would be easy to have more shower stalls. It would be a drop in a bucket in terms of expense for the Brazilian government, and yet it wasn't provided. Um, yeah, I agree, Linda. So I wanted to just comment on a couple of the messages in the chat, and then we'll get to the Q&A. So if you have questions, please do write them in the Q&A. So from Richard K, I too have issues with DXC. Thankfully, Sung, so Wayne Sung. I know a lot of people don't know who these people are or organizations. That's why I'm trying to give a bit of background without getting too distracted. So thankfully, Sung has grown up. I actually like him now. So Wayne Sung was is one of the founders of DXC, and DXC is an organization that a lot of people had, a lot of problems with, and with him specifically. But the thing is that we never partnered with DXC. We never worked with them or anything like that. But the fact that we also we were neutral and we didn't cancel them. We didn't say they cannot come to the march. One time, 2 years prior, we had Wayne speak at a talk of ours was reason enough to cancel us. And what I'm trying to say here is that that is really quite ridiculous when you're facing climate collapse, you're working on very important issues. You have a climate summit where, the summit itself has created an initiative to raise funds to give to rancher organizations. And the one group that is fighting against that is being canceled because of this sort of internal politic issue. So I feel very proud that I never got involved in those dynamics. I feel like for me, it was a question of integrity to not get involved in that. And if we were sidelined as a result, that's okay because I prefer to have that, steadfastness. But what it shows me is that here you have people and movements who are just not focused on change making, really, and who are getting distracted or focusing on the wrong things. And so, going forward, uh, just we need to take that into account and say, okay, these are not the places where change is being, worked on seriously. Now, the thing of, I'm sorry you had to go through such dynamics. I'll look at the link. So for whoever's interested in the topic of destructive dynamics, there's a podcast, Fuck It Canceled, can help reflect on the topic. I don't know it. I'll look at it, but I want to mention, I'll plug my own writing here, that I actually have written a bit about our experiences and what we've learned, and in my opinion, applies more broadly speaking to this sort of whole nonprofit system that has been created these past decades and that I think is not always conducive to challenging power and creating meaningful change. So I wrote a book chapter that is titled Meet the New Vegan World. So again, the title is about the vegan world because that was more the topic of the book, but it really is more broadly about the nonprofit system. So the title of my chapter is Meet the New Vegan World, and it's in a book called Oppressive Liberation, uh, Sexism in Animal Activism, I think, by Lisa Kemmerer. So I wrote a bit about these dynamics, these experiences in that book chapter. Now, the book itself is very expensive. It's priced as a, college textbook, so it's I can't remember, but very expensive. But what I suggest people do if they would like to read that chapter and the others also, um, is to request from your local library that they order the book. And that way you get to read it for free and also you make it accessible to other people. So again, the name of the book is Oppressive Liberation, Sexism and Animal Activism by Lisa Kemmerer. And again, even though the titles are focused on animal activism, the vegan movement, a lot of what's written there, both, Lisa's writing and I tried to as well, is applicable more broadly speaking to the nonprofit system. All right, so let's take a look at the Q&A. Oh, were the programs at the MT educational venues recorded and posted, Mark? Unfortunately, I don't think so. At least the spaces that I saw were not. So so the space was very, very big. It was a college campus and it was huge, which was one of the logistical challenges because you had to walk so far to find this room, find that room, and a lot of people just didn't know where to go. We had a hard time finding our own room. Um, so I think that probably some of the things that happened in the larger spaces were filmed. I don't know where they might have been put up. However, there was so much going on in the smaller rooms, and if anybody filmed, it would have been just they brought their own camera and did it. Which is fine. I mean, we used to participate in a conference here in the Bay Area, Soil Not Oil, and that's also how it worked there. You would get a room and you would bring your own camera, and that's fine. But in this case, there was just not enough communication to really know exactly what to expect, and just people, mostly it seems, did not bring them. That was one of the reasons that I wanted to bring in the first people who did the webinar in this series, because I thought their talk was so interesting, and there wasn't a big audience. So I wanted to share it with more people. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't think so.
I want to chime in on this because this was something that both you and I noticed that was very frustrating. Um, so as we mentioned, right, there were many talks over the course of about 4 or 5 days. Some of them were incredible. Some of the subject matter was fascinating. What was also interesting is that many of these people came from abroad. So they came from Colombia, they came from Mexico to give these talks. They show up to these spaces and they're literally empty rooms, right? So many of them actually abandoned their talks. They didn't even give it because there was nobody else to give it to, right? So that's part of the reason why many of these talks were not documented. They never happened, right? And we personally saw, at least in two cases, where people were coming from abroad, from Argentina, from Chile, from Colombia, from Mexico, going into these spaces to give talks. And because nobody showed up, they just didn't give them. And it became sort of like, at best, an informal conversation between a couple of attendees. But often they would just pack up and leave. And this was very unfortunate. Hopefully, it only happened to a minority of presenters, but it really shows the risk of not of kind of like you aim too high, right? I think that's what the conclusion that I came to. They had a very ambitious vision for this event, while it could have been probably half as ambitious and more effective, right? And I think this is a lesson for us here in San Francisco and California in the United States as we organize events, to keep it more constrained, right? And to manage expectations, but also to be respectful of both attendees, presenters, and anybody going and being in these spaces. We say in the labor movement that we need to start on time and end on time. We need to be respectful of everybody's time and effort, right? And I think here, at least for some of the people that we spoke to, again, hopefully a minority, it was not at all the case. Very unfortunate.
My guess, yeah, I think so. I feel, and I may be wrong, but I've said this before. I feel if I compare this event with Copenhagen in 2009, um, to me it felt less cohesive. I felt in 2009 that the activists who were there were more together. And Martha, who you saw speak, she was in Paris. What year was that, Gemma? Well, anyway, she was in Paris and she said that also, it was very cohesive and um I think, I mean, it's not that the intent was for it to not be. I think, just sometimes logistics, organizational issues. Um, but because of that, my assumption is that for some groups, it wouldn't be like that. Like I ran into, people who were with larger social movements and they're sort of doing their thing. And for them, it makes sense. So, yeah, I think that if we were, for example, I don't know if we're going to try to participate in the next COP in Turkey. For me, it's really a question of um, being very purposeful and figuring out what exactly we want to achieve. Is it worth it? To go all the way and so on. Um, at this particular event, there were actually a couple veganic farmers before I left who expressed interest in joining us. But because it was pretty close to, we spoke about it when we were already, like, it was close, getting close to the date. Because of that, it didn't work out for either of them to be able to come. And I'm so grateful that it didn't work out. Because it was just logistically, there were a lot of challenges. And I think that having, four people instead of two would have been, again, very challenging. I think they would have come all the way and then maybe they'd, be disappointed that there's a small audience. And so, I'm happy that it didn't work out for the sake of the farmers. But I'm thinking now, okay, so that is nonetheless a good idea. Um, but if we do something like that, we have to do it in a way that really makes it worthwhile, where we're very intentional about, making sure that there is a large audience, that they're really getting something out of it. And in that sense, I think that it is very worthwhile to engage with the sort of like eco farming community and also more broadly speaking with leftist groups. I think it is a worthwhile thing because we're already on the same page. Like there's already at a place like the People Summit, they're already talking about agriculture, they're already talking about agroecology, and the fact that some of what we're saying is not on their radar doesn't mean that they can't be receptive to it. But I think that even in a place like the US, it is worthwhile to, like speak to groups like the Sierra Club and sort of confront them on their positions. So generally speaking, I think that that is really a worthwhile effort. But, the specifics of how we organize, where we do it, we're just going to have to be very intentional about it.
Let's see here, another comment from Richard K. What does it say about dignity when there are 6 showers for 2,500 people? Completely agree. And I want to be kind and give them the benefit of the doubt and assume they just didn't expect this level of turnout, right? But I also think that it wouldn't have taken a lot more planning, even, when they saw the turnout, whenever they saw the interest, to literally just truck in a few more showers and hire a few more cleaners, right? So I think and this is the sad and heartbreaking thing as well, because I know for certain that many of these people attending came from marginal areas of Brazil, from marginal areas in other parts of South America and North America, that they were they were willing to tolerate these circumstances and not complain. But this is part of the reason why I think it is important for people like Nassim and me to speak up, because I think that some of these folks might be willing to accept these circumstances because they think, well, it's manageable. But we also know that for the events like this, where it's critical and crucial for them to be present in the blue zone, in the green zone, visible and engaging with the negotiators when they're having to wait 45 minutes to take a 2-minute shower and then wait another 30 minutes to get some food in the morning, that detracts, right? And again, it becomes a question of who is getting the attention from these negotiators, right? So these folks are ending up at a huge disadvantage when it comes to these conferences. And I certainly hope that this doesn't mean that countries like Brazil and other places will just abandon the idea of having indigenous presence. I think it is critical. I think it is crucial, and I think it needs to be happening every single day, right? But it needs to be done with a minimum of dignity and effort, right, for it to be effective. Otherwise, it becomes tokenizing, right? You just have folks who are making their way to the spaces an hour or 2 hours after everybody else has already spoken to and cajoled and persuaded the negotiators, and then they have to leave 2 hours early because, well, they need to eat and take a shower, right? So very unfortunate. For me, it was definitely a lesson. But it was also an exciting space. Even though I come from a town that is originally indigenous, I've never really had the opportunity to be in a space surrounded by so many of these relatives, right? To be in a room with indigenous people who, speak Dutch and who speak French, who speak Spanish, who speak English, who speak Spanish was definitely unique, right? And yeah, a very interesting and unique experience, right? That I wish could have not been overshadowed by, illness and lack of toilet paper and stuff like that.
I wanted to feel free to write more questions if you like. We can go a little bit longer, but if not, we'll close. But I wanted to say, so today in a few hours, I'm going to go to a protest here in San Francisco against the war with Iran. Um, often people in various in various circles, various activist circles, whatever it is that they're working on, have the conversation at some point of, do protests work? Do they have an impact? And I don't think you can give a categorical yes or no to that question. I think it just really just depends so much on what the point of it is, what you're talking about, who you're addressing. Um, but if the goal is to create sort of a change of heart or a change of policy, um, by those in power, by the billionaire class, by elected officials, I think that often protests are not effective. So, when the Iraq War was starting, there were, so many people protesting in so many countries, and it didn't have any impact whatsoever. Again, that doesn't mean that protests have no worth. I think that depending on what it is that you're protesting about and who the audience is, it can be very powerful. But even in something like this, like an anti-war protest, that, it's not like Trump is going to be like, oh my God, they protested in SF. So it's not that. But I think that these spaces can be first steps towards something else. And it can show others that there are people who think like them. And again, that can give you a certain amount of optimism to organize. But ultimately, I think that, and I'm coming back to unions. I've never been part of a union. I've never organized with a union. Well, I mean, except for like, the march. But I'm coming back to that because with, the war on Gaza, I have been thinking from the beginning, what is a protest going to do? What is, so many things are so completely ineffective because we don't have representation. We don't really live in a sort of democratic system in that way. So where do we have power? And we have power through various types of disruption. And so with Gaza, it has been, workers have been one of the drivers of disruption, like, dock workers who are refusing to, you know, help ship weaponry, that sort of thing. So I think that protests can be a good thing in terms of rallying people and showing that there are others who think like you. But ultimately, whether we're talking about war or other issues, we have to think really more about how can we be effective. And for me, so much about changing our agricultural systems and transitioning away from corporate agriculture to agroecology is about divesting from these corporations and about divesting from a system that drives so much of it. I mean, when people can't make a living as farmers, they're pushed into other industries where they are exploited as workers, where they are creating pollution through those industries and so on. And so it's really about divesting from all of this so that we can build something else. But I also think that we can think about this idea of divestment and disruption in many ways. And again, connecting with other people from other movements who might have the power to make a difference. Oh yeah, yeah, Kathy Carpenter. Yeah, I haven't seen that documentary, but I saw that Code Pink. I wanted to join. I haven't seen it yet, but that's a good but I'll recommend it. I'll go ahead and recommend it without having seen it yet. So there's a documentary called Earth's Greatest Enemy, and I think my understanding is that the documentary sort of shows how the US military is such a big contributor to global warming. Their emissions are the largest, are most of any institution on the planet, and so on. So, yeah, I'll be watching that. All right. So, are there any questions left?
Yeah, there's a couple. So I'm going to answer this one by Richard Kay. Is it any surprise that immature people cherry pick evidence in an age of socials and information overload? The last thing needed is AI. Yeah, actually, this is interesting because that is certainly perhaps one of the changes that we've seen between the COPs that I have either attended or been associated with, right? The rise of social media when we went to 2009 in Copenhagen. This was at the very beginning of Twitter and Facebook. They started to be present, but it really wasn't a dominant force of nature, as it were, as it was 5, 10 years later. And to me, that is part of it, right? That back then, first of all, I think people were willing to be a lot more generous with each other in terms of sharing their time and listening to each other and discussing, right? But I think for me, the biggest challenge is how captured we all collectively became to algorithm or algorithmic information, right? When we are on Facebook, when we're on Twitter, when we're on all these social medias, I think really the unfortunate reality is that we're seeing and being exposed to what these companies are allowing us to be exposed to. And if something is not popular enough or is controversial enough, it can be hidden from sight unless you really make an effort to go and look for it, right? And sometimes even then, right? So I think this is one of the unfortunate realities that we feel like we have access to a lot of information, and it's true, we do, but it's information that has been curated and selected from us, right? So I think it's very unfortunate that we're in this sort of predicament. And then of course AI is more of the same. Thank you for highlighting this question of the U.S. military. You all have probably been keeping up with this back and forth that the Pentagon and the Department of Defense, aka Department of War, have been having with two San Francisco-based companies. One of them is called Anthropic, and the other one is OpenAI. One of them creates the AI chatbot called Claude, and the other one makes the AI chatbot called ChatGPT. And basically, the Pentagon is trying to do their best to be able to use these technologies for war, right? Specifically for autonomous military weapons. So essentially, killer robots. And so they're going through this back and forth, right? So we see the unfortunate realities of technology. But I also want to say that I was very fortunate to have cut my teeth in a lot of this mobilization and organizing in the early 2000s, 1999, 2000, 2001, 2002, when we had just started with a lot of these technologies, and they were real boon in terms of able to communicate things out there. It was the advent of these corporate entities that really created a huge challenge in social media. So, I tell people there are still spaces that are not controlled by corporations. You know, we saw this huge explosion of Mastodon and the federated universe in terms of social media. So if you are not on it, I definitely encourage you to try out Mastodon. See the Commons does have a presence on it. And, we get a lot of good engagement. I'll put the chat here. I'll put the link in the chat for people to look.
Should I go ahead or? Oh, okay. All right. Oh, first, Anne, if you can share the webinar. Yeah, of course. We're going to put up the recordings as soon as possible on YouTube. And of course, you can share them with whoever you like. So yeah, we'll try to do that soon. Um, and PTO Carpel, I'll try to answer your question. I realize, yeah, I wasn't super clear earlier, and I'll try to not go be a bit brief about it. Yeah, we focused on movement building, and now we're talking more about focusing more on advocacy. So there are a couple aspects to this. Um, we did a lot of sort of movement building. And I think that what we achieved was really quite amazing when you look at sort of when we did the first People's Harvest Forum in 2015. And then, that's the first time that we had veganic farmers come together, be on a panel. And it was a panel about agroecology, which I'll get to when I answer the second part of your question. But, we put veganic forth. And then in 2018, we have these farmers marching on Market Street. And, so we really did achieve a lot. So I'm not saying, that it was a failure or it was a mistake or anything, but because I don't think I could have expected in 2014 when I was talking about these things that we could achieve so much in that amount of time. So it was largely very positive. However, we did repeatedly sort of face this dynamic where there's sort of this thing of like, yes, we want the ideas, yes, we want the work, yes, we want the indigenous aesthetic, yes, we want to talk about the milpa and so on. The milpa being the indigenous system, and Chema really is the person who came to the realization that the milpa was a veganic system, and we wanted to build a movement, so we wanted to share that with people. Yes, we want this, but at the same time, we exclude or we just want to take and not include. And so at some point, you have to think about what is sustainable here. Is it sustainable to continue that way? And sometimes there's malice. There has been malice, as I said, twice already. We were victims of cancel culture, and sometimes there's like greed. Sometimes it's not exactly malice, but it is sort of greed. Like I remember when we were organizing the march in 2018. Um, Totally aside from the cancel culture things that I talked about, this was a separate thing. I remember maybe like 10 days before the march, receiving a newsletter. I received newsletters from various groups, and I received a newsletter from an organization that had not been involved so far in the organizing of the march. And I know because I was involved. And they sent out a newsletter to raise funds, asking their supporters to donate because they were going to be at this march. And they said, we are the only vegan organization talking about, climate and organizing about this. And wrote to them and I said, I mean, not only are you not the only ones because we're here, but you haven't even been here. I mean, it's just a lie. You haven't been involved at all. And they were just jumping in. And I don't think that in that case, people would tell themselves I'm being malicious, but it is a harmful behavior because instead of supporting the grassroots groups that are doing all the work, they're like, oh, I need to, get the funding for myself. And ultimately they don't have the same message. And so our messages also get lost along the way. So you have a lot of stuff like this, or you have like again, without it being malicious, but I remember once I put a lot of work. We have a website called veganic.world that we haven't updated in years because, at some point it's just not sustainable. And there was an interview there. And I put a lot of work into that interview because we weren't doing things on Zoom. We had to go places. In those days when we would go places to do events, to, give talks, to host classes, to interview people, we had to rent a car, which meant raising the money to rent a car, while working part-time to do all this stuff. And then, the interview, I spent a lot of time editing it with the person to make it really compelling. And then this organization just copied the interview. And even though they put a link to see the comments, nobody's going to click on the link when they can read the whole thing on their website. And I wrote to them and said, I did not authorize you to use this. Please remove it. And they didn't remove it until a year later. We had to send them a legal threat. And they probably think, oh, these people, are being a bit too particular. But this is really important. These things really harm grassroots groups when you're doing this kind of work and doing it for free and working on the side. And, you're trying to get $10 here and there to rent a car or to bring farmers in. And so it becomes unsustainable. So that's one thing. The other thing about sort of advocacy versus, having more of an advocacy approach to promoting veganics. So again, I'm not going to want to get into this too much because it would be too long, but a lot of my thinking around what we should do with Seed the Commons came from seeing that a lot of people were going from vegetarian or vegan back to eating animal products. And so what it seemed to me is that we were not, we were sort of failing at really challenging the normativity of meat consumption. And so the default kind of way of vegans of promoting what they're promoting is, and that I used to do too. I went vegan in 94 and I stopped eating animals in 91. So, I had a while where I was also doing that was that you try to kind of arm yourself with the most arguments you can. Like, oh, I'm going to make the case that it's better for health, and I'm going to make the case that it's better for the environment. And now, if I can find someone who can help me make the case that it's better for social justice, all the better. And that makes my case stronger. And it's not that it's bad to do that. It has had good impacts, but I think that it's ultimately not enough. There's something missing in that approach. And that's why we keep kind of not entirely getting there, because I think that we're never entirely sort of internalizing that this is a new norm and acting sort of accordingly. And so an example here of like not really getting there is that you had the movie Cowspiracy that came out, and so a bunch of people went vegan, and we used to we used to offer gardening classes that were taught by a farmer who actually went vegan because of that movie. So obviously that movie did, really great things. But as a response to that movie, you had Kiss the Ground, which was like, the reaction to that and so on. And so for me, strategically, from an animal liberationist perspective, it seemed that what we need to do is not put forth veganics as something that's another kind of like in competition with these other approaches, but rather, if it's genuine, of course, which in my case it is, put forth the approaches that we need to put forth, but look at farming cows or chickens the same way that we would look at farming dogs or cats. Like this is just not something that we do, and so to work within those parameters. And so, like the first event that we had, it wasn't a panel on veganics so much so as it was a panel on agroecology, but I worked hard to find people, and I found four of them who could genuinely speak about agroecology, but as farmers who are also vegan. And so for example, if you look on we don't have a lot of stuff up on YouTube. Unfortunately, we're going to work on getting more of our old stuff up. But there is a video that's called Agriculture and the Soil Solution. And so that's an example of the approach. We want to talk about soil and why we should focus on regenerating soil and how we can do that. But we're going to have two experts there who also happen to not be promoting using cows in that system. And so, from an animal liberationist perspective, I think that that is a more powerful approach ultimately, because you're not sort of always setting this up as, I'm not looking at veganic farming as one thing, and then you have regenerative as one thing, and then you have agroecology as one thing, and you have conservation ag as one thing. It's not like that. It's more these approaches done in a vegan way. Now, to do that, especially before we were doing, Zoom, to have that approach, um, it's a lot easier to have the buy-in and the support of people of a movement who can help you do that. Because if you're going, it's always good to have support, of course. But if you're saying, if you want to say, well, I want to show people that being vegan is better for health. Of course, it's better if you have support, but you can do it on your own as well. You can set up a website, you can set up a blog, you can set up a YouTube channel, and you can just talk about veganism is better for health, and you can do that. But the strategy that we had, it really required more buy-in from basically the vegan community to help us create that space where we could be leaders more broadly speaking in sort of the eco-farming thing. And we did somewhat succeed, but again, because, we saw that there was, this kind of like competitive nature and all, and people back then also weren't getting it. They weren't sort of, seeing the value of, now it's sort of changed. People are getting it more. But all of that sort of led me to think, okay, we have to focus less on that strategy and focus more on just these are the benefits of veganics, which we had decided to do anyways with the first climate march, because from a climate perspective, I do think it's valuable to do that. It's worthwhile, it's powerful. But from an animal liberationist perspective, I still think that that other strategy of not sort of making veganics just this one thing that's better for X, Y, and Z is sort of ultimately going to be more powerful to help normalize, normalize a new ethic. So I don't know if that was clear. Maybe I'll try to address it another time if it wasn't. Yeah. Yeah, a puppy mill is basically a dog farm. I mean, yeah, like I say, oh, like people, I try to compare like, well, we speak up about dogs, so we should speak up about pigs. This sort of, we draw these comparisons to make a point, but it's true that we don't necessarily as a society treat dogs all that well, for sure. Um, there's a lot of work to be done there to treat dogs better. But I still use those examples to contrast our approach to those animals with, animals that have been designated as farm animals, because, um, even though there's a lot of cruelty towards dogs, if you see someone in the street, let's say hitting their dog, and you say that person's a monster, that person, you condemn that person, typically people are going to agree with you, they're going to support you in challenging that person. And so we have a very different attitude towards people who do the same with, you were mean to a pig, you can't, if someone was mean to a pig or eats a pig, you can't really say anything. You can't say that person's a monster because then you're, a judgmental and so on. And so there is still a different set of norms, even though it's not exactly true that we treat dogs so well. And actually, if people don't mind, I have no connection to this organization. But when I was in Thailand, I visited this, I visited what's it called? An animal sanctuary. They have dogs and cats there. And I'm on their newsletter. And at some point, maybe about a month ago, I think, they sent out a fundraiser email because they received a dog in their care that had been stabbed in the back with a kitchen knife. And yeah, it just makes me very sad. I have some qualms about animal sanctuaries and then what are they buying and so on, but I think for medical care, still it's good to donate. So if people don't mind, again, I have no connection with this organization. I just happen to be on their newsletter, but if people don't mind, I'm just gonna share the link here. Also, I'm gonna find it and share it, since we're talking about cruelty against dogs, if people want to help with their medical expenses. But don't, let me see, I'll find the link. Don't, um, basically be forewarned that I'm not sure how to, damn it. Sorry, I'm gonna look for, if you find, I'm not sure how to, I can't really forward an email, put an email thing, and I think now that link might not be, I'll just put their donate thing. But you can look for it if you want about the dog that was stabbed. But obviously don't look at that if you don't want to see that image. All right. Chama?
Thank you. Yes, I'll share it out in the chat.
I already, oh. Yeah, I shared their donate thing. I couldn't find their thing about that specific dog. I'm sure you can find it somewhere. But I just shared it because I thought, might as well help them out. All right.
Well, with that, we're getting close to time. So unless anybody has any additional questions or additional comments, I think we're getting close to wrapping it up. Anything else you want to say, Nassim?
No.
No. Well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure hosting you all now for this is our fifth
Oh,
webinar in
oh,
3 weeks. And,
this.
and oh yes, please mention.
Oh, there is still this. So also, if you would like to donate to see the comments, that would be very helpful to us. And I think Chama can add the link to our donate page as well. And if you donate $25 or more, you can ask us to send you this tote bag. Let me put it in a way that you can see.
Yeah.
All right.
Well, thank you all. Thank you, everyone. And keep in touch. We'll send out more with our next steps. Have a great Saturday and rest of the weekend.
Thank you. Bye.